In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Did today's gospel reading feel a bit like a story about raising a young girl from the dead that gets abruptly interrupted by this other woman who is healed along the way, and we're not quite sure what she's doing? If the gospel reading made you question Mark's ability to write a coherent narrative from beginning to end, you'd be in the company of some 19th and 20th century German and French New Testament scholars like Bultmann or Trochmy. But if you're willing to take a step back and ask the question, why would Mark throw this seemingly unrelated story into the middle of another? If you're really willing to ask that question, you might begin to find some answers. In fact, since the 1970s, it's become standard to speak highly of Mark's ability as a writer. This particular way of interpolating one story into another, which Mark likes to do, has come to be called informally by English speakers a Markan sandwich. You can tell Americans invented this term. Of course, our German colleagues, our German New Testament scholars are too serious, if you will, to talk about sandwiches. They have a much more serious name for what Mark is up to here. They call it ein Andeschachtelungen, whatever that means. But what modern-day scholars have come to realize is merely what the church has always known. The middle story in that sandwich helps to drive home a theological point that Mark is trying to make. The two stories feed off of each other to draw your attention to a web of theological teaching about the new kingdom that Jesus Christ came to establish. So let's take a look at this story. Jesus gets off the boat, and immediately Jairus, one of the elders of the local synagogue, perhaps in Capernaum, comes to him and falls at his feet, begging him to come and heal his dying daughter. So Jesus goes with him. But there's quite a crowd, since people have been hearing about how Jesus is healing sickness and casting out demons. And along the way, one of the people in that crowd is this woman who has had a menstrual hemorrhage for 12 years. She's in constant pain, and she spent all her wealth on doctors and physicians, but her condition has only worsened. Weaving her way through the crowd, she reaches out in faith and touches the hem of his garment, believing that that is all it would take to heal her. Immediately, she feels the healing. She's whole again, and she slinks back into the crowd, thanking God and smiling. But just as she thought she would be able to get away with it, Jesus stops and says, "Who touched my clothes?" You can feel her heart sink as she's overcome with fear and tries to stand unnoticed in the crowd. But Jesus persists. "Who touched me?" Now at this point, the disciples try to keep him moving. They say, "Come on, Jesus, there's a huge crowd around us, and you're worried about who touched your wrinkled, dirty clothes. We've got to hurry on to get to heal Jairus' daughter. So keep moving, Jesus." But Jesus stands there and begins to look through the crowd, searching for the person who touched him. Now you have to know something about the ancient purity laws to appreciate the mortal horror this woman was feeling at this point. For 12 years, this woman was having a hemorrhage, making her ceremonially unclean. She would not have been able to go to the temple, to go into the synagogue, and she would have been avoided by any respectable Jew, especially a male rabbi, since she was unclean. She had reached out at Jesus' clothing in the hope that she would go unnoticed. She reached out to touch his clothing because she could not imagine asking him openly to lay his hands on her and heal her. Why would a rabbi in good standing allow himself to touch her? Why would he allow himself to become unclean to heal her? But now Jesus won't let up. He refuses to move on until he's found her, and she's terrified. She's absolutely afraid he's going to condemn her, but she also knows that when their eyes meet, he will perceive that it was she who touched him. So she throws herself out there, knowing it's her best chance. She could be rejected and cast away, but it wouldn't be the first time. So she falls at his feet and confesses everything. She tells him the whole story, while Jairus is over there looking at his watch, thinking, oh my gosh. And in disbelief, of course, Jairus is thinking, well, how can this unclean woman hold this whole thing up when my daughter is dying? Every second matters. But this woman is telling everything to Jesus about her condition, about her healing, and in desperate hope that Jesus might just have compassion on her. And he does. But he doesn't stop merely at having compassion on her. He calls her his daughter. Did you notice that? This is likely the first time in 12 years that a rabbi has not avoided her. But he doesn't end with simply affirming her physical healing. He goes on to tell her to go in peace. He brings her back into the shalom of the people of God and restores her relationship not only with God, but with the community of God's people. An act that goes well beyond physical healing and touches the depths of her psyche and soul. But while all this is going on, Jairus receives news that his own daughter has died. And as he is about to lose faith, Jesus encourages him, do not fear, only believe. And taking Peter, James, and John, along with the parents, Jesus makes his way through the mourners who have already begun to assemble, goes into the room where the child is lying, and he speaks the words, Talitha cum, and the 12-year-old girl is raised from the dead. Now, the story we just looked at is a story about faith, about the faith of Jairus on behalf of his daughter for healing. It's a story about the faith of an unclean woman who cannot even verbalize her faith because of her shame. It's about the testing of Jairus' faith as he has to overcome his own fear and persevere in the midst of hopelessness. But the story we just looked at is also a story about the unclean becoming whole again. It's about the outcast who isn't even allowed into the synagogue, receiving healing before the insider, the one who is the synagogue elder's daughter. So it's a story that makes us realize, that sort of subverts our own thinking about who God is concerned about, who God wishes to heal. The story we just read about is about the establishment of Jesus' kingdom, a kingdom where there is a balm for every sickness and peace for all who seek Jesus. But perhaps above all, the story we just read about is a story about the source of life itself. In John's Gospel, Jesus says, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. And this is what Jesus is doing. He is here that they may have life and have it abundantly. There are many contrasts and comparisons to be made in this story. But at the root of both of these stories, of the 12-year-old girl and of the unclean woman, is the issue of life and fertility. The woman who is bleeding away her very life. She is not only cut off from the life of the community because of her perpetual state of uncleanness, but she is cut off from the possibility of marriage. She is cut off from the possibility of childbearing. And as her life slowly bleeds away, she is suffering a sort of state of living death. In the case of the 12-year-old girl, she is dying at the beginning of the story. Her father's faith leads him to fall down before Jesus to beg for his healing touch. But the girl dies before Jesus arrives. Yet Jesus goes beyond any expectation and brings life itself. Not merely healing, not merely restoration, but life itself. He restores this girl who herself is about to begin feeling in her own body the cycles of bringing forth life. The story is about a new kingdom on earth where life eternal is breaking into the corrupt world of sin and death that has persisted since the fall. Although these two women will eventually go on to die of different causes, they will forever be witnesses of the new life-giving, life-bearing order that comes to fruition in the resurrection. They will be witnesses to the fact that Jesus came to bring life and to bring it abundantly. These women are also symbols of the bride of Christ. The 12, I believe, marks not only a time span, but also the fact that they represent the bride of Christ, like the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles. They represent the Israel that is inside the synagogue, part of the part of that inner group, and also the Israel, or the people of God who have been cast out from that inner group, and yet will receive healing and inclusion. What this story represents is another episode in the vast struggle between life and death that began at the Garden of Eden. It is a story that reveals who Jesus Christ is as the bridegroom of the church. The bridegroom who gives life to the bride, just as God gave Eve life through Adam's rib. So we find in this story that the relationship of Jesus Christ to the bride is one that engenders this culture of life. What is in contrast to what the recent popes have called the culture of death that pervades this world. You see, the Christian sacrament of marriage was never simply about two individuals coming together saying, I love you, you love me, let's get married. That's more like Hollywood. The Christian marriage is about manifesting this relationship that Jesus has with the bride, a relationship that at its root is not simply about love, though it is about love. It's about a love, though, that in its complete state is a life-giving, life-bearing love. The marriage partners become the locus of a new family, a new creation. The Christian sacrament of marriage is about a love that reveals and proclaims the source of life. Jesus healing the hemorrhaging woman is about a restoration of the womb, a new life-bearing presence. The same thing with the 12-year-old girl. He is creating a new life-bearing presence. And so Jesus said, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. And so he does. The life Jesus brings, however, is ultimately a life that is greater than what our corruptible bodies can handle. So even though we receive life from the very source of life, Jesus Christ himself, our mortal bodies do not have the capacity to receive this gift in its fullness until they die and resurrect on the last day. Incorruptible, as Paul assures us. Life is the most basic thing we have. And whether we like it or not, the curse of death overshadows us all. And the good news of the gospel is that Jesus came to begin a momentous shift from death to life that culminates in the resurrection. He came to restore fertility so that new life could be brought forth, so that we might have life and have it abundantly. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.